The exterior physical properties and design for this book are exquisite. Typically, I disdain fancy production values for books as they're almost always just expensive and unnecessary bells and whistles to give an illusion of the deluxe. Here, however, I love it because it services both form and function. We have this plastic slipcover that is not only more visually striking and creative than a dust jacket, but also far more sturdy. Though it also means scratches and scuffs show easily and somewhat spoil the beauty, but at least it's very protective of the book itself, which is a faux leather material with a minimalist gold printed design. This is usually the go-to for any book trying to come across as deluxe, but here it makes thematic design sense because it's supposed to mirror a school yearbook. As much as I appreciate the idea and think it's absolutely appropriately and intelligently done, I will say though that I ultimately would have preferred this design printed on normal cover paper. No, it wouldn't look or feel as nice or immersive, but it would have been more durable, because both the gold and leather are sensitive as hell to marking. Plus, it also would have been cheaper. Speaking of cheap and where that money could have been better invested, the deluxe production values were reserved solely for the exterior materials, because the paper quality, while certainly not bad or a problem, is still as dangerously low as you would want to go for an art book before crossing over into strategy guide paper. But the last and best thing I admire about the physical nature of the book is the size, the page dimensions. It's slightly more compact than the video game art books you get from Dark Horse or Udon, and that's fantastic because more often than not those are unnecessarily large, whereas here they have identified the perfect size for their book rather than just defaulting to the oversized standard. And even though its pages are smaller, it's still got just as much content with 320 pages. The book collects artworks from River City Girls 1 and 2 as well as 0, though with 0 it's only the additional art created by WayForward, so nothing from the creation of the original 94 game, which is sad but ultimately makes sense given the book. When it comes to larger AAA franchises, I hate having multiple games compiled into one book, but for smaller games like this it makes total sense. And I'm so glad that WayForward held off from doing the usual indie thing of releasing lame mini art books as part of the collector's editions, which I wouldn't have bothered with, and instead held off in order to release a proper, satisfying art book like this. I want to press start and pause for a second. If you like high-octane art books filled with crazy, colorful gals, you may be interested in checking out 2 books I created, Roller Derby Girl Gang, an art anthology, and She's a Wildcat, The Art of Candy. Even though this may seem like a shameless, disruptive plug, which it is, but I also genuinely think they're visually and thematically relevant to warrant recommending here. Continue. So more important than the size and number of the pages is if they're being used properly, and boy have they. So the size of the pages, the size and layout of the images, and the quantity of the images per page, and thus the book as a whole, these are the things I complain about most on this channel, but here they are all 9 out of 10, and consequently the book and the reader benefit so much from this, where the failure on this front tarnishes most art books. One slight dissatisfaction is some of the pixel art backgrounds and maybe the NPC sprites do suffer a little from being too small. As magnificent as the size, layout, and quantity are in principle, and in practice too, but it's a shame it doesn't mean as much as it should, given that the curation doesn't quite measure up to the same level. Essentially, the book has 2 major connected weaknesses. The less serious is that the vast majority of the images are identical to what you've already seen in-game, to the point that it frequently just feels like a catalog of in-game assets, which is not only underwhelming because it's stuff you've already seen, but actually even less visually engaging because all the elements are isolated. So, for example, the pixel art backgrounds are still beautiful to look at even though I've already seen them a ton, but they're still not as good as they appear in-game because here they're lifeless, liminal spaces since their characters and items and stuff aren't present. Meanwhile, the character sections are even worse, the only actually boring parts of the book, because it's just pages of final looking isolated character poses and expressions. For each character there will be between 4 and 14 images that are essentially identical. It's so boring and pointless, I don't know why they would think anyone would want to see this. Particularly disappointing because that's what takes up the most space. This then leads to the book's biggest weakness, which is the sensation of visual repetition throughout. Sometimes it's because the images, while technically different, are still visually homogeneous, as in the case of poses and expressions, while other times it is literally the same visuals printed again and again. Even when you appreciate that it's still beautiful, well-designed art, it's underwhelming and not as enjoyable as just looking at screenshots from the game where it's all integrated and alive. Though as a consolation, I will say for this book specifically, the blow of these issues is softened significantly when you're talking about such fun, stylish eye candy as this. Plus, though it's unfortunate these issues are present in the majority of the book, but it doesn't affect the book entirely, with the rest putting up a good fight against it in order to sway the overall opinion. I just wish that wasn't a factor that needed to be considered. But in terms of the good stuff that doesn't fall under the above, there's quite a bit. All the best stuff in this book can be found in the bonus and miscellaneous sections, though sadly they are also the shortest, but this is where you'll get a wider visual variety of stuff that is unseen, behind the scenes, or just works that have more visual merit in their own right. So for example, there's a 10-page section of sketches and stuff, but that also includes a couple of early and alternate designs for some characters. There's also a page of unused characters for the first game, that's good. Storyboards for the intros and cutscenes, designs and illustrations for all the merch, that was a really great inclusion. But also, to illustrate what I meant by works with visual merit in their own right, that would include stuff like the promo illustrations, the tarot cards, the manga pages. Like the in-game art assets, this is stuff that's final and you'll also have already seen. The difference is these works are visually interesting and enjoyable enough on their own to warrant collecting in a book, compared to seeing the 10th almost identical isolated image of a character taken from the game, which doesn't exactly have the same visual engagement. Lackluster as some of the curation may be, if you want to put a positive spin on it, I will say this book does a marvelous job of feeling like a comprehensive visual archive, and I don't suspect literally complete. I've spoken before how an art book that contained every image created for a project would not only be unfeasible, but would hit a point of diminishing returns in terms of the book's impact and enjoyment. I'm saying it's that this book gives the sensation of a comprehensive archive, even down to things like UI elements and achievement icons, or that each character's page uses the unique typography for their names. Again, it's not as impactful as having already seen this stuff integrated in-game, but it's a pretty cool and novel inclusion in terms of satisfying thoroughness. But mostly it's thanks to the great inclusions I mentioned before, like the merch design and photos, the uncropped teaser posters. It's not just stuff from the game, it's the River City Girls franchise visual bible. I mean, even something that felt a little like padding, like having 20 pages of storyboards. Nonetheless, I think it's kind of cool that they included all of them. So this is the view where you can sort of put a positive spin on all the character poses and stuff, though I think it's a stretch to suggest their inclusion benefits the book more than their absence would in exchange for actually interesting content. The only unequivocally bad and stupid inclusion in the book is that all the manga pages are printed twice, once with text and once without. Oh, but this way you get to see the full art? No. It's simple black and white art designed to have space for the text. It's unnecessary, wasteful filler that offers nothing. Ditto the 6 essentially blank pages in the book, which look like they were supposed to be a fun space for characters to sign or write a message or something. Instead, they're just empty pages. It may not seem like much, but it all adds up. But to dovetail both the above points of wasteful versus complete, I don't get the impression that this is the sort of book where they are holding out on a ton of better unseen stuff that theoretically could have been included. You know, I've said it gives that impression of satisfying thoroughness, as well as the inclusion of some early art. In fact, there are even some early mock-up screenshots for when they were pitching the game. Only 2, but really awesome to see. So on the one hand, it feels like they have included everything they should, but on the other, we obviously don't know if that's actually the case. Apart from an introduction, you'll have seen there are occasional little bits of text throughout. It's commentary that about 25% of the time is good little pieces of trivia. 75%, however, is just the most bland, frivolous nothings, to the point that I'm not sure whether I should be angry at the person who wrote them or embarrassed for them. They could think that most of this stuff constitutes anything of value or interest to anyone, so don't come here expecting a lot of information. This book displays so many good, intelligent bookmaking practices that it feels a shame to have that be in a tug-of-war against the less impressive elements for the ultimate assessment of the book. And these are elements and issues that are not unique to this book. In fact, greater than 95% of video game art books suffer from these same issues. But going through this book got me thinking about the nature and purpose of game art books in general, that in order to succeed to be a genuinely meaningful, worthy experience, it has to be more than just a presentation of in-game assets and design components, things looking final and repetitive. It's not only lazy and underwhelming, but as we've seen here, because it's isolated and sterile, that diminishes the visual interest even further, because not only have you seen so much of it before, but you've seen it better and alive in game. Obviously, I understand the purpose of why this art is the way it is in terms of making a game. I'm questioning its purpose for a book, and if that purpose could be made greater. So to use this book as an example, that would mean taking one of three directions. 1. Solely, or at least predominantly, rely on featuring works that are visually interesting in their own right, so either unseen or behind the scenes stuff, or if it is just final art, then have it be the type I was talking about earlier that has enough visual merit and enjoyment to stand on its own just as a piece of cool art that warrants collecting in a book. That could be done exclusively or in combination with 2. Art books for smaller games often struggle to provide richer visual experiences that can carry a satisfying book when the focus is solely on the art, simply because they don't have the ability to generate as much art as huge AAA games. A good way to compensate that is to do a book that eases the burden of the art having to carry the whole experience, such as having more reliance on making of using text to discuss design creations and insights and look at the game in a more overall sense rather than just the art in order to make up more content that would be genuinely interesting. That's something I think this book would have benefited greatly from. Because it's so wild and draws from a long history, it seems like the perfect game that would be able to say a lot on the behind the scenes creation front, which is why the crappy text that is here is a doubly disappointing wasted opportunity. Alternatively, in terms of a book that also takes some pressure off the art, is the third option, which is by far the one I would have liked to see, and that is to create a fiction-focused lore book type thing. This publisher has actually done immersive in-world books before, for example, the Earthbound Handbook. So, take the idea of this yearbook further. Look at something like what was done for Life is Strange, which was half a yearbook, half a guide to the town. They could have done a character-focused yearbook thing combined with a guide to River City, which, unlike Life is Strange, is actually a fun and interesting world. I adore how vibrant and over-the-top it is, and so would have loved a book that leaned more heavily into its greatest strength and appeal, that is its spirit and world. Because while the art in this book obviously still has that vibe, this separated clinical presentation doesn't allow it to live up to, or at least take advantage of it as much as it could. Even if it's merely just repackaging the lore and visuals from the game into book form, at least that would give them new context, purpose, and a novel experience for fans that is unique and supplements the game experience. That would have been more enjoyable and creative than a simple art book that just regurgitates the individual ingredients. Even some sort of hybrid book would have worked here, just introduce light elements of that to overcome some of its issues. So, like, rather than just having a character's page be a bunch of almost identical images, if there really are no other early or interesting artworks for them, remove the filler and use that space for text, either non-fiction, so insight into the character's creation and design, obviously providing it's of a vastly superior caliber to the sort of text that is here, or in terms of fiction and continuing the yearbook concept, have an in-world fact file or bio type thing, maybe with the girls scribbling their comments in the margins. Any of this would be better than 4 essentially identical images for each character that you've already seen. So no matter how good or enjoyable this book nonetheless genuinely is, it still feels like a missed opportunity to make something better. Again, me bringing this up and dwelling on it for so long is not at all intended to be some heavy criticism leveled at this book specifically. I'm just using it as an example because it evoked these musings on the nature and purpose of art books in general, which might seem like irrelevant theoretical discussion of what the book could be rather than just reviewing what it is, but I wanted to share these thoughts anyway because I think it's relevant to this channel's regular audience's food for thought when it comes to art books overall, but it also does establish and illustrate the parameters of this book's enjoyment, worth, and the experience you'll get, and will help you more accurately assess its personal appeal to you.